A decorated police officer is found lifeless in the snow, his body bruised, his blood frozen, his life stolen. The woman who once loved him is now accused of killing him. In the quiet town of Canton, Massachusetts, what began as a tragic discovery quickly unraveled into a storm of suspicion, betrayal, and controversy. The accused? Karen Ridd, a former finance professor and devoted girlfriend. The victim? Officer John O'Keefe, a respected veteran of the Boston Police Department. As the headlines spread and the courtroom filled, two stories emerged. One claims this was a drunken, jealous act of rage. The other, a chilling conspiracy involving secrets, silence, and a possible cover-up by those sworn to uphold the law. One man is dead. One woman is on trial. And an entire community is left asking the same haunting question: what if everything we've been told is a lie? Karen Ridd was not the kind of woman who drew suspicion. Educated, respected, and successful, she taught finance at Bentley University and built a life around structure, discipline, and control. Friends described her as smart, driven, and fiercely loyal. To many, she was the kind of woman who had it all. Then she met John O'Keefe. He was everything Karen wasn't: an officer on the front lines of Boston streets. Charismatic, admired by his peers. Known for his sense of duty, John had spent 16 years serving the city, and those who knew him said he loved being a cop almost as much as he loved his family. Together, Karen and John made an unlikely pair. Two professionals from different worlds drawn together by love, ambition, and a shared longing for connection. For a time, things seemed good. Appearances were kept, smiles were posted, their lives, public and private, moved forward in tandem. But beneath the surface, something was shifting, something neither of them could control. Because what brought them together would ultimately tear lives apart.
January 28th, 2022, a cold Friday night in Massachusetts.
Karen Ridd and John O'Keefe had plans to meet friends, have drinks, unwind. By all accounts, it began like any ordinary night. They visited multiple bars, conversations flowed, drinks were poured. Text messages show the couple moving through the evening together, laughing, mingling, being seen. But underneath the social smiles, something else stirred. Witnesses later recalled tension. Karen had allegedly argued with John earlier in the evening. Some said she was drinking heavily. Others described her as calm, in control. Like so many things in this case, the truth depends on who's telling it. As the night drew to a close, a group of friends made their way to the home of Brian Albert, a fellow officer. John was invited. Karen was not. And here the story begins to fracture. Karen told investigators she dropped John off outside the house around midnight. She claimed she circled the block, waiting for him to go inside, but he never did. No one remembers seeing him enter. No one called to say he was safe. She drove away. He disappeared into the night. By morning, John O'Keefe's body would be found in the snow, face up, cold to the touch, bleeding and bruised, just feet from the house where friends had gathered, where laughter had echoed just hours before. What happened in those missing moments remains the beating heart of this mystery. Was John O'Keefe struck down by the woman who loved him? Or did something far more sinister take place behind closed doors? The morning of January 29, 2022 was bitterly cold. Snow still blanketed the ground. Everything seemed still until Karen Ridd began calling John's phone again and again. No answer. Panic set in. She told investigators she had a sinking feeling something was wrong. She retraced her steps, driving back to Fairview Road in Canton, the last place she had seen him alive. Then she saw him. John O'Keefe's body lay on the snow-covered front lawn. He was motionless. His face was injured, his eyes swollen shut. There was blood on his nose, scratches on his arm. His phone was missing, his keys gone, his body freezing. Karen screamed. She called 911. She began CPR. At one point, she allegedly said something chilling. I hit him. I hit him. Oh my God, I hit him. To the officers who arrived at the scene, it sounded like a confession. But to Karen's defense team, it was anything but. They argue those words were not an admission, but the panicked cries of a woman in shock, desperate, traumatized, and confused. And then the focus turned. Not to the house behind the body, not to who might have been inside, but to Karen. Within hours, the woman who found the body was transformed into the prime suspect in a murder case. The community was stunned. How could a man like John, an experienced officer beloved by family and colleagues, end up dead in such a way? And how could the woman who once called him her partner be responsible for his death? The media pounced. Headlines spread. The story of the fallen cop and his accused girlfriend made national news. But behind the sensationalism, behind the grief and anger, one question began to take shape. Was this truly a case of reckless drunk driving and guilt? Or was Karen Ridd being framed for something she didn't do? From the moment John O'Keefe's body was discovered, investigators began shaping a narrative, one rooted in alcohol, jealousy, and rage. According to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Karen Ridd was intoxicated the night of January 28th. Prosecutors allege she was angry, possibly upset about not being invited into the house where John was going. They claimed she dropped him off, then in a fit of rage reversed her SUV, struck him, and drove away, leaving the man she loved to die in the snow. The state's case hinges on a single theory. Karen Ridd backed into John with the rear passenger side of her Lexus SUV. To support this, they point to three key pieces of evidence. First, the vehicle itself. Investigators found a broken taillight on Karen's Lexus. Tiny fragments of red plastic were discovered near the scene, suggesting him. Second, John's injuries. They argue that the pattern of wounds on his body, particularly the blunt force trauma to his skull, matches a vehicle strike. And third, Karen's own words. The phrase "I hit him," repeated in a panic at the scene, has been used by prosecutors to imply guilt. They brought in expert witnesses. A forensic pathologist testified that the injuries were consistent with being struck by a motor vehicle. A toxicologist estimated Karen's blood alcohol content was 0.113 over the legal limit. Based on the timing of her last drink, they painted a picture of a night gone wrong. A woman drunk, emotional, and unhinged. A man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. A tragic moment that escalated into deadly consequences. To the jury, the prosecution offered a simple, devastating conclusion. Karen Ridd ran over her boyfriend, and then she left him there. But as the trial unfolded, cracks in that version of events began to show. Because for every piece of evidence the state presented, the defense had another explanation. And what they revealed would turn this case upside down. The prosecution told a story of guilt, but Karen Ridd's defense team came prepared to tell a different story. One of conspiracy, corruption, and a cover-up cloaked in blue. From the very beginning, the defense questioned the integrity of the investigation. Why, they asked, was the home where John was last seen, Brian Albert's house, not thoroughly searched? Why were witnesses from inside that home never treated as suspects? And why did police immediately zero in on Karen Ridd? The defense introduced an alternate theory. They argue that John O'Keefe never made it out of that house alive. According to their version, John entered the home and got into a violent altercation, possibly with someone inside. He was beaten, injured, and either pushed or carried outside, where he was left to die in the snow. Karen, they claim, had nothing to do with it. To support this, they pointed to what they called glaring omissions in the state's investigation. No search warrant was ever executed on the house. Surveillance footage from surrounding homes mysteriously disappeared. And the broken taillight? They argue it was planted. Forensic experts hired by the defense claim John's injuries were inconsistent with a car strike, pointing instead to signs of blunt trauma and even signs of being dragged. They highlighted blood found on John's arm that didn't match Karen, and bruises that, in their words, told a different story. And then came the most explosive accusation. That officers involved in the investigation had personal ties to people inside the Albert house, creating what the defense called a blue wall of silence. According to Karen's lawyers, the real killers weren't just hiding in plain sight. They were being protected. And suddenly, this wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It became a story of trust, of power, of whether a woman with no badge could ever truly fight against the system designed to protect its own. As the courtroom battle raged, a very different war broke out beyond the courthouse walls. Canton, Massachusetts, once a quiet suburb, was now the epicenter of a national scandal. Lines were drawn, friendships fractured, neighbors turned on one another. You were either with Karen Ridd or against her. On one side, people who believed Karen was being railroaded, targeted to protect others. They gathered in protest outside the courthouse, held signs that read, "Justice for John means truth for all," and "Free Karen Ridd." They accused the police of hiding the truth, of protecting their own, of burying evidence that didn't fit their version of events. On the other side, supporters of law enforcement who saw Karen not as a scapegoat, but as a manipulative, guilty woman trying to shift blame. They stood firmly behind the prosecution. They believed the evidence was clear. The taillight, the confession, the blood alcohol level, it all pointed to her. The media frenzy only added fuel to the fire. true crime bloggers, TikTok detectives, YouTube commentators. Each one dissected every detail of the case, frame by frame, word by word. The courtroom had become a theater, and outside the town became its audience. Angry, emotional, divided. For many, this was no longer just about Karen Ridd or John O'Keefe. It had become something bigger, a reckoning over truth, over power, over how much faith we can put in those who wear the badge. And in the middle of it all, grieving families, a dead man's legacy, and a woman who insisted she was innocent, while the world watched her every move. In a case built on perception and pressure, the witnesses were supposed to bring clarity. Instead, they brought chaos. As testimony unfolded in court, familiar names surfaced: friends, neighbors, law enforcement officers, but what they said often raised more questions than answers. Witness after witness struggled with timelines. Some remembered seeing John go inside the house. Others weren't so sure. One said Karen was emotional that night, another described her as fine. But one thing stood out: how many of them had direct ties to law enforcement? The house where John was last seen belonged to Brian Albert, a Boston officer. The people inside, friends, family, even former colleagues. To the defense, this was no coincidence. It was a red flag. And then came the questions that hung in the air like smoke. Why was John's phone never recovered? Why wasn't the snow surrounding his body fully preserved for evidence?
Why did police fail to immediately search the Albert home?
The defense pressed harder. They accused one witness, Jennifer McCabe, of deleting a suspicious Google search, "How long to die in cold?" She claimed it was an innocent, misremembered moment. The defense said otherwise. Even the forensic timeline didn't add up. If John had truly been hit around midnight, why did the snow beneath him appear undisturbed? Why were there no clear tire tracks leading to where his body was found? Each piece of testimony unraveled a little more of the official story, not because it offered new answers, but because it revealed just how many questions still remained. What happened that night was supposed to be simple, but the deeper the jury looked, the more the truth became tangled in contradiction, missing evidence, and doubt. And as the trial pushed forward, the shadow of uncertainty grew longer. For weeks, Karen Ridd had sat silently in court, expression guarded, emotions tightly held. But when she finally stood up, the courtroom fell into stillness. Now it was her turn to speak. Under oath, Karen didn't just deny guilt. She told her story. She spoke of a relationship with John that was real, but at times rocky. She admitted they had argued that night, but said she loved him. She would never hurt him. Her voice cracked as she described waking up to unanswered texts, panic creeping in, and returning to that snow-covered street, only to find John lying there, lifeless. She recounted performing CPR, screaming for help, watching the man she loved grow cold in her arms. Then came the moment prosecutors clung to.
"I hit him."
Karen told the jury it wasn't a confession, it was a frantic reaction, a horrifying thought in the chaos of the moment. She wasn't stating fact, she was spiraling in fear. Her lawyers walked her through the timeline, her calls, her texts, her memories of that night. She answered each question directly, sometimes with sorrow, other times with quiet defiance. Then came the cross-examination. The prosecution pressed hard on her drinking, on her behavior, on why she didn't just stay with John until he was safely inside. They tried to paint her as reckless, unstable, angry, but the jury didn't just hear her words, they saw her. A woman accused of killing the man she loved, standing alone against the very system that said she was guilty. And for the first time since the trial began, the weight of the case no longer rested on speculation. It rested on whether the jury believed her. After weeks of testimony, photographs, and speculation, after tears, protests, and headlines, the trial of Karen Ridd finally neared its end. Now it was time for the attorneys to deliver their final words, the moment that would leave the deepest imprint on the jury and the public. The prosecution went first. They reminded the court of the broken taillight, of the bloodied body in the snow, of the alcohol, the arguments, and the words they could not forget. "I hit him." They called it a tragedy born of recklessness. A woman too drunk, too angry, too careless. They asked the jury to consider not who Karen Ridd used to be, but what she did that night.
They told the courtroom, "This is not about conspiracies, it's about consequences."
Then the defense rose, and they struck back with force. They accused investigators of tunnel vision. They pointed to lost evidence, botched protocols, and conflicts of interest. They asked why no one in the house was investigated, Why a man as experienced as John O'Keefe would freeze to death steps from a party of fellow officers unnoticed. And they reminded the jury that reasonable doubt is not a feeling. It's a standard, a legal shield against speculation. They ended with a challenge. If you cannot say exactly what happened that night, then you cannot convict. And with that, the courtroom fell silent. The jury was sent to deliberate. Hours passed, then days. Outside, the crowd swelled, voices on both sides growing louder, angrier, more desperate. Inside, 12 jurors sat with a burden of truth. Guilt or innocence, justice or mistake. A lifetime decided by strangers in a quiet room. Because no matter how loud the world screamed, in the end it all came down to them. The courtroom was packed, the air suffocating. Reporters, family members, strangers holding their breath. And then the jury returned. The judge read the decision. Each word carved into history. But we're not here to say what they chose. We're here to ask, did they get it right? Because whatever verdict was delivered, one truth remains unchanged. John O'Keefe is gone. A respected officer, a brother, a friend, a man who dedicated his life to service, now at the center of a national firestorm. And Karen Red, whether found guilty or not, will never be free from the shadow of that night. She's been called a murderer, a scapegoat, a victim, a liar. This case split a town, rocked a state, and raised a question bigger than any one person. When the system is the suspect, who do you trust? Even now, supporters gather in Karen's name. Others stand firmly by the prosecution. And in between, the unanswered questions still echo. Why wasn't the house searched? Why did the investigation move so fast? And what really happened between midnight and morning? In the court of public opinion, the trial is far from over. And the next chapter may be written not in verdicts, but in voices, yours included. So we ask you, do you believe Karen Red is guilty? Was justice served? Or was it buried under a storm of power, loyalty, and silence? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you want more real cases that raise hard questions, uncover buried truths, and tell the stories others won't, subscribe to Crime Vault, new episodes every week. Because justice isn't always black and white, and the truth, it's often hidden in the shadows.